1,000 miles of frozen Montana plain, nothing but white. Then a farmhouse, alone, smoke curling from the chimney into a sky bruised purple-black. Inside, a woman stands at the kitchen sink, hands under warm water, eyes locked on the dirt road stretching toward the highway. She has been watching that road for 3 years. Today the road watches back. A black truck idles at the property line. The engine growls low. The driver's door swings open. A man steps out, wool overcoat, leather gloves. He walks to the mailbox, pulls out a letter, reads the handwriting, and smiles. She built a room beneath the earth to hide from him. She sealed it with steel. She stocked it for war. She never planned on a blizzard locking them both inside. Something moved beneath the earth. That was all Sheriff Callahan could say for certain afterward. He was standing at the edge of a ruined property in the pale March sunlight, sipping coffee from a thermos, watching the backhoe tear apart what was left of a collapsed 1940s timber barn. They had already found the black truck, already found the body, already started paperwork to bring in cadaver dogs for the woman they assumed was buried somewhere in the frozen mud. And then the ground cracked open. A steel plate burst upward through the debris. Deputies drew their weapons, and from a dark hole in the earth, a hand reached out. But that moment was still 3 years away. This story starts in Chicago. Claire Whitfield was good at saving people. That was not a boast. That was a clinical fact. 8 years in the emergency department at Rush University Medical Center. Trauma rotations, cardiac arrests, gunshot wounds on Saturday nights. The kind of work that taught you to read a room in 2 seconds flat and act in 3. She was 31 years old, 5'6". Brown hair she kept short because long hair got grabbed during patient codes. Steady hands, quiet voice. The kind of nurse that residents trusted more than they trusted themselves. And she was tired. Not the normal tired. Not the 12-hour shift tired that a hot shower and 8 hours of sleep could fix. This was the bone-deep tired of a woman who had spent her entire adult life taking care of everyone except herself. Her mother had died 2 years prior. Ovarian cancer. Fast and brutal. Claire had been the one to manage the hospice. The medications. The insurance calls. The funeral. She had handled all of it with the same calm efficiency she brought to the ER. And then she had gone back to work the next Monday. Because that was what Claire did. So when Marcus Thornton walked into her life, she didn't see danger. She saw relief. He came into the ER on a Tuesday night, not as a patient, as a visitor. One of his junior associates had been in a car accident on the Dan Ryan Expressway. Minor injuries, lacerations, a fractured wrist, nothing dramatic, but Marcus treated it like a crisis. He arrived in a charcoal suit that cost more than Claire's monthly rent. He spoke to the attending physician by name. He had already called the hospital administrator. He wanted the best orthopedic surgeon. He wanted a private room. He wanted updates every 30 minutes. Claire watched him from the nurse's station, thinking, this man takes care of his people. Which was true, in the same way that a shepherd takes care of his flock. He noticed her noticing him. You're the one who stabilized Jeremy's wrist in triage. Not a question. Standard protocol. Standard protocol doesn't include calling the patient's wife to tell her he's okay before the doctor even finishes the assessment. Claire shrugged. She was probably scared. Marcus smiled, and it was a good smile. Warm. Focused. The kind of smile that made you feel like you were the only person in a very crowded room. Marcus Thornton. He extended his hand. Claire Whitfield. And visiting hours ended 20 minutes ago. He laughed. And that was that. The courtship was textbook. Not textbook romance. Textbook predator. But Claire didn't know that yet. Because Marcus Thornton was the most patient hunter she would ever encounter. He didn't rush. He didn't pressure. He studied. First date. A quiet Italian restaurant in Lincoln Park. He asked about her mother. He listened. Actually listened. not the performative head-nodding that most men did while waiting for their turn to talk. He remembered details: her mother's name, her mother's favorite flower, gardenias. 2 weeks later, a bouquet of gardenias appeared at the nurse's station with a card that simply read, "For the woman who remembers everyone else." And Claire, the woman who had spent 2 years grieving alone, who had no siblings, no father in the picture, who had exactly one close friend in the world, a 67-year-old head nurse named Donna Kessler, who had mentored her since residency, Claire thought. Finally, someone who sees me. He did see her, the way a locksmith sees a lock. Every pin, every tumbler, every weakness that could be manipulated with the right amount of pressure. They married 14 months later. Small ceremony. Courthouse. Marcus said he didn't want the fuss of a big wedding. What he actually didn't want was a room full of witnesses who might notice things later. The first 6 months were beautiful. The next 6 months were confusing. The 6 months after that were hell. It started with the small things, which is how it always starts. The comment about her scrubs being unflattering. The suggestion that she didn't really need to go to Donna's retirement dinner. The observation that her hospital salary was cute compared to what he earned in a single deposition. Each comment delivered with a smile. Each suggestion wrapped in concern. Each observation followed by a kiss on the forehead and a quiet, "I just want the best for you, sweetheart." Claire stopped wearing scrubs she liked. She skipped Donna's dinner. She stopped mentioning money. And Marcus noted each concession like a poker player counting cards. The escalation was so gradual that Claire couldn't pinpoint when normal became abnormal, when concern became control, when love became surveillance. By the end of the first year, Marcus managed the finances entirely. Claire's paychecks were direct deposited into a joint account that only Marcus monitored. She had a credit card, his name on the account. He reviewed every statement. "You spent $40 at that coffee shop on Halsted. Were you meeting someone?" "I was meeting Donna." "Donna, the old nurse. You two spend a lot of time together." "She's my friend. She's a 70-year-old woman who fills your head with ideas about independence. You don't need that kind of influence, Claire. You have me." And that sentence, right there, that was the skeleton key to everything Marcus Thornton believed about the world. You have me. Meaning, you don't need anything else. You don't need anyone else. I am the sun. You are the planet. Orbit accordingly. Claire stopped seeing Donna regularly. She told herself it was because she was busy. She was lying. By year 2, Marcus had installed tracking software on her phone. She didn't discover this herself. A tech-savvy ER colleague named Jay noticed her phone pinging an unfamiliar server during a break and told her. "That's a commercial spyware package," Jay said, keeping his voice low. "Logs your calls, your texts, your GPS, everything." Claire stared at the phone in her hand. Every call she had made to the domestic violence hotline 6 months ago, the one she hung up on after 30 seconds, because she convinced herself she was overreacting. Marcus had heard it. Every text she had sent Donna saying, "I think something is wrong with my marriage." Marcus had read it. Every late-night Google search for signs of emotional abuse and how to leave a controlling husband. Marcus had seen it, and he had said nothing, done nothing, because that was the game. Let her know that he knew without ever confronting her directly. Let the paranoia do the work. Let her wonder how much he'd seen. Let that uncertainty become its own prison. Twist the knife so slowly that the victim blames herself for bleeding. Claire filed for divorce on a Thursday in October. She expected rage. She expected screaming, thrown objects, the dramatic meltdown that television had taught her to anticipate. Marcus did none of those things. He sat in his leather armchair, crossed his legs, folded his hands, and smiled. "Okay," he said, "if that's what you want." That calm, that absolute terrifying calm. That was when Claire understood she was not married to a man with anger issues. She was married to a strategist, a man who had spent 20 years in courtrooms learning how to destroy opponents without ever raising his voice. The counterattack began within 72 hours. Her bank accounts were frozen. A legal motion she didn't understand, filed by a judge who played golf with Marcus every Sunday. Her hospital received an anonymous complaint about medication discrepancies on her shift. Fabricated, but enough to trigger an internal investigation that put her on unpaid leave. Her landlord, the apartment she had rented as a temporary separation space, received a call from someone claiming to be a building inspector. Suddenly, her lease was under review. Her few remaining friends began to distance themselves, not dramatically, just quietly. An unreturned text here, a canceled lunch there. Years later, she would learn that Marcus had contacted each of them individually. Concerned husband reaching out. Claire was having a mental health crisis. She was making wild accusations. He was trying to get her help. Please, if she contacts you, let me know. He didn't need to threaten anyone. He just needed to be more believable than she was. And he was, because Marcus Thornton was a wealthy, articulate, respected professional, and Claire was a burned-out nurse going through a messy divorce. Within 3 months, Claire had no income, no savings, no friends, no apartment. She was staying in a women's shelter on the west side, filling out paperwork for restraining orders that Marcus treated like parking tickets. She filed 3 separate orders of protection. Marcus violated each one. Nothing happened. His attorney argued that his client's visits were motivated by genuine concern for his estranged wife's well-being. The judge agreed. The judge always agreed. And then came the white rose. March, 2 a.m. Claire woke up in the shelter, disoriented. Something was wrong. Something in the air. A scent that didn't belong. Sweet, floral, expensive. She reached for the lamp on the nightstand, clicked it on her pillow, 6 inches from where her head had been resting. A single white rose, long stem, no thorns, wrapped in a pale silk ribbon. The shelter had a security desk, cameras, a locked entrance that required a buzzer after 9 p.m. None of it had mattered. Claire sat in her bed, holding the rose, and she understood 3 things with perfect clinical clarity. 1. Marcus had entered a locked women's shelter while she slept, which meant he had either bribed or manipulated someone on staff. 2. He had stood over her sleeping body, close enough to place a flower on her pillow, close enough to do anything. 3. The restraining orders, the courts, the police, the shelter system. None of it would save her, because Marcus didn't operate within systems. He operated above them. She had 2 choices: stay and wait for the night when the rose was replaced by something else, or vanish. Claire chose to vanish. Her mother's jewelry, that was all she had left. A small velvet pouch that Claire had kept hidden inside a tampon box in her shelter locker, because Marcus would never look inside a tampon box. Even his surveillance had limits. 2 rings, a bracelet, a pair of pearl earrings that her mother had worn on her wedding day. Not her wedding to Claire's absent father, her wedding to Claire's stepfather, a kind, quiet man named Gerald, who had died of a heart attack when Claire was 19. Total value at a pawn shop on South Pulaski, $4,100. Claire cried when she handed the earrings over. Not because of the money, because those pearls were the last physical proof that her mother had existed, that Claire had come from somewhere, that she had been loved before Marcus taught her to doubt whether she deserved it. She used the cash to buy a prepaid phone, a bus ticket, and through a legal aid attorney who specialized in domestic violence cases, she established a blind LLC registered in Wyoming. The LLC purchased a foreclosed 40-acre property just outside Darby, Montana. Population, approximately 700, the edge of the Bitterroot Valley. The kind of place where the nearest neighbor was a mile away and the county sheriff covered an area the size of Connecticut. The property was called Hollow Creek Farm. Although calling it a farm was generous, it was 40 acres of dead grass, rusted fencing, a two-story farmhouse with a leaking roof and single-pane windows that rattled when the wind blew, which was always, and a massive dilapidated 1940s timber barn slumping in the back like a tired old man who had given up on standing straight. Claire arrived in June, driving a used Subaru she had bought for cash in Billings. She had one suitcase, $300 left, and the kind of fear that lived permanently in her chest like a second heartbeat. She told herself this was freedom. It felt like exile. Darby, Montana. The town was one main street, a gas station, a post office, a bar called the Sawmill that smelled like pine needles and spilled beer, a feed store with a hand-painted sign that read, Begley's Feed and Supply, serving the Bitterroot since 1974. Claire needed fence posts. She drove to Begley's on her third day in town. The store was dim and cool inside, smelling of grain dust and leather, stacked floor to ceiling with bags of chicken feed, horse supplements, salt licks, dog food in 50-pound sacks. The kind of place that hadn't changed its inventory or its decor since the Carter administration. Behind the counter sat a woman who looked like she had been carved from the same wood as the building. Ruth Begley, 72 years old, white hair pulled back in a braid so tight it could anchor a boat, hands like leather work gloves, a face deeply lined by sun and wind and whatever else life had thrown at her over 7 decades. She wore a flannel shirt buttoned to the collar and reading glasses perched on the end of a nose that had clearly been broken at least once. She looked up when Claire walked in, said nothing. Claire approached the counter. "I need fence posts, cedar, about 50 of them." Ruth studied her over the reading glasses. "You the one who bought the Hollow Creek place?" Not a question. "Yes." "Cash sale, LLC out of Wyoming." Claire's stomach dropped. "How did you—" "Small town. County clerk's wife buys her dog food here." Ruth pulled a thick catalog from under the counter, flipped it open. "Cedar posts, 8 foot. Got them out back. You need wire, too." "Probably." "You done fencing before?" "No." "You done anything on a farm before?" "No." Ruth looked at her for a long time, the way a doctor looks at an X-ray, not judging, diagnosing. 50 cedar posts for 40 acres is about 30 short. I'll put 70 on the truck. You can pay me when you can." "I can pay now." "I know you can. I said you can pay me when you can." Claire opened her mouth, closed it. There was something in Ruth's voice that didn't allow argument. Not authority, exactly. Recognition. "Thank you," Claire said. Ruth nodded. Then, quietly, almost as an afterthought, "I bought my place with cash, too. 1982, different county, same reason." Same reason. And in those 2 words, Claire understood that Ruth Begley knew exactly who she was. Not her name, not her history, but what she was. A woman who had run from a man who believed he owned her, because Ruth had been that woman 40 years ago. Neither of them said anything else about it. Not that day, not for months. It lived in the silence between them, a shared wound that didn't need to be displayed to be understood. Ruth started showing up at Hollow Creek on Saturdays. She never announced herself, never called ahead, just appeared in her battered green Ford pickup around 9 in the morning, tailgate loaded with whatever she had decided Claire needed that week, a box of canning jars. "Tomato season's coming." A bag of rock salt. "Your porch steps will ice over in November. You'll break your neck." A 20-pound bag of dried beans. "More protein per dollar than anything in that grocery store." Claire protested exactly once. "Ruth, I can't keep accepting." "You're not accepting. I'm delivering. There's a difference. Don't make it weird." So Claire stopped protesting, and Ruth kept delivering. And somewhere between the fence posts and the rock salt and the canning jars, something grew between them that neither woman named, because women like Claire and Ruth didn't use words like friendship easily. They had both learned that naming a good thing out loud was the fastest way to lose it. But it was there, In the way Ruth would sit on Claire's porch after unloading the truck, drinking coffee from a thermos she brought herself, never asking questions about Chicago, never asking questions about the man Claire was hiding from. Just sitting, present, solid as the mountains behind her. And once, only once, Ruth said something that Claire would carry with her into the dark. They were watching the sun go down behind the Bitterroot Range. The sky streaked with orange and violet. Ruth set her coffee down, looked out at the mountains, and said, "The hardest part isn't surviving, Claire. The hardest part is believing you deserve to survive." Claire didn't answer, because her throat had closed, because that sentence had reached into her chest and grabbed something that had been locked away since the night she woke up to a white rose on her pillow. Ruth picked up her thermos, stood up, walked to her truck. "See you Saturday." And she was gone. Donna Kessler. The one thread Claire had not cut. Donna was 67 years old, retired head nurse at Rush, 5'2", silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, a voice like warm gravel. She had mentored Claire from her first day on the floor, taught her how to start an IV on a screaming patient, how to deliver bad news to a family without breaking, how to survive the emotional carnage of emergency medicine without losing your mind. When Claire vanished from Chicago, she didn't tell Donna where she was going. She couldn't. Any digital communication was compromised. Marcus had proven that. But 3 weeks after arriving in Montana, Claire walked into the Darby post office, rented a P.O. box under her LLC name, and mailed a handwritten letter to a P.O. box in Oak Park, Illinois. A box that Donna had set up specifically because Claire had asked her to, in person, in a hospital bathroom with the faucet running, 2 days before she disappeared. The system was simple. Claire wrote letters by hand, mailed them from Darby to Donna's P.O. box. Donna replied the same way. No emails, no phone calls, no digital trail, just paper and ink and the United States Postal Service, which felt almost absurdly old-fashioned. But old-fashioned was untraceable. Claire's letters were careful. She never mentioned Montana, never mentioned the town name, never mentioned the farm. She wrote about the weather in vague terms, about learning to can tomatoes, about a kind older woman she had met, about the mountains. Donna's letters were warmer, full of hospital gossip, updates on mutual colleagues, gentle reminders that Claire was missed, that Claire mattered, that the world she had left behind still existed and still had a place for her. And always, at the end of every letter, the same line. "We're still here. Come home when you're ready." Claire kept every letter in a metal lockbox under her bed. She read them on the nights when the silence of the farmhouse felt less like peace and more like burial. August, 2 months after arriving in Montana. Claire was in the Darby Public Library, using the single ancient desktop computer to check county property records. Something Ruth had suggested. Know your land better than anyone who might come looking. She typed in her LLC name, pulled up the filing. Normal, expected. Then, on impulse, she searched for her own name. Claire Whitfield. Nothing in Montana. Good. She searched Marcus Thornton, and her blood turned to ice water. A property inquiry, filed 4 months ago, through a private investigation firm based in Denver, requesting LLC ownership records for properties purchased with cash in rural western states within the past 2 years. The request had been narrowed by date range, by purchase price, by acreage, her parameters, exactly her parameters. Claire sat in the library, the overhead fluorescent light buzzing, a teenager across the room watching skateboarding videos with the sound on, the librarian stamping returns. And Claire understood. Marcus had found the LLC, maybe not the address yet, maybe not the exact property, but the LLC. The shell company she had built to hide behind. He had found it, and the inquiry was months old, which meant he had known, and he hadn't come, which was worse. So much worse than if he had come immediately, because it meant he was waiting, planning, choosing his moment. the way he always did. Claire closed the browser, walked to her car on steady legs, drove home at the speed limit, parked in front of the farmhouse, walked inside, locked the door. Then she sat on the kitchen floor and shook for 45 minutes. When the shaking stopped, she looked at the barn, specifically. She looked at the crumbling concrete foundation in the far dark corner where the old horse stalls used to be, and she began to plan. The bunker. Claire didn't call it a bunker. She called it the bedroom, because that made it feel less insane, less like the act of a woman who had crossed over from cautious into paranoid, less like admitting that her entire life had been reduced to digging a hole in the ground to hide from a man in a suit. But it was a bunker, and building it nearly killed her. She started in late August. The first step was breaking through the 6-inch concrete slab in the back corner of the barn. She rented an electric jackhammer from a tool supply company 2 towns over, paid cash, gave a fake name. The jackhammer was loud, catastrophically loud, the kind of noise that would carry across the valley on a still Montana night and have every neighbor within 5 miles calling the sheriff. So Claire waited for thunderstorms. When the sky turned black and the lightning cracked over the Bitterroot Range and the thunder rolled through the valley like God dragging furniture across the floor, Claire ran to the barn, fired up the jackhammer, and hammered at the concrete in synchronized bursts, timing each strike to the thunder. It took her 3 storms to break through the slab. Beneath it, dense, packed, Montana clay, gray and cold and hard as a grudge. She dug by hand, every night, after dark. She climbed down into the growing pit with a short-handled spade and a headlamp, and she dug. She filled heavy canvas bags with clay and dirt, dragged them out of the barn, loaded them into her Subaru, drove to a deep ravine at the back of her property and dumped them, covered the fresh earth with dead branches and leaves. Then she drove back, showered, set her alarm for 4 hours later, and did it again. Her hands bled first, then blistered, then the blisters tore open and bled again. Then calluses formed over the raw skin, thick and yellow and hard. Her hands stopped looking like a nurse's hands. They started looking like a miner's. Her shoulders burned. Her lower back seized up so badly, some mornings she couldn't stand upright for 20 minutes. Her knees swelled. Her fingernails cracked and split. She cried most nights, not from sadness, from pain, from exhaustion, from the sheer absurd loneliness of a woman digging her own grave to avoid being put in one. But she did not stop, because every shovelful of dirt was a down payment on survival. Every inch deeper was another inch between her and Marcus Thornton, and that math was simple enough to keep her going when nothing else could. 3 months. She carved out a space 12 feet long, 10 feet wide, 8 feet deep. She poured a new concrete floor, reinforced the earthen walls with cinder blocks and heavy-duty rebar she hauled in from a supply depot in Missoula, framed it, insulated it, covered the walls with fire-resistant drywall. And because Claire was a nurse, because she understood air and blood and oxygen and the thin biological margin between life and death, she built the ventilation system with obsessive precision, a modified air filtration unit salvaged from a wrecked RV in a junkyard outside Hamilton, PVC intake and exhaust pipes running up the side of the barn, disguised as ordinary rusted drain pipes, the intake cap curved downward to keep rain out. She installed a chemical camp toilet behind a partition, a heavy-duty military cot, shelves stocked with canned food, bottled water, medical supplies, antibiotics, bandages, a suture kit. Because old habits. Power came from deep-cycle marine batteries wired to a concealed solar panel on the barn roof, a small battery-operated audio monitor, receiver in the bunker, transmitter hidden in the barn rafters so she could hear what was happening above, and the entrance, a thick fireproof steel door, laid flat over the opening, over the steel hatch, a false floor made of reclaimed barnwood, perfectly matched to the surrounding planks, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. And on top of the false floor, A hollowed-out rusted iron tractor engine block, heavy enough to look immovable, light enough for Claire to push aside if she knew where to grip, surrounded by heavy dusty bales of alfalfa hay. To enter, move 3 specific bales, slide a hidden metal latch, use the hydraulic piston to lift the steel and wood trap door, climb down the wooden ladder, lock the deadbolt from inside. To find it, you would have to know it existed. Ruth helped without being asked. She showed up one Saturday with 80 pounds of Portland cement in her truck bed. Didn't explain. Didn't ask what it was for. Thought you could use this. Ruth, don't. She came back the next week with rebar, then PVC fittings, then a case of canned soup so heavy Claire nearly dropped it. Ruth never went into the barn, never asked to see what Claire was building, never asked a single question, because Ruth understood that some things were built out of love, and some things were built out of fear, and sometimes they were the same thing. Late November, the bunker was complete. Claire stood at the bottom of the wooden ladder, looking up at the steel hatch sealed above her, the LED lights humming softly, the air cool and still, the concrete floor solid under her feet. She had done it, alone, by hand, in the dark. 3 months of bleeding and digging and crying and dragging bags of dirt through the Montana night. She sat down on the military cot, pulled the sleeping bag around her shoulders, and for the first time in 3 years, Claire Whitfield slept through the entire night. No nightmares, no white roses, no sound of a key turning in a lock that shouldn't be turning, just silence and darkness and the heavy comforting weight of 8 feet of earth between her and the world. She believed she had outsmarted the devil. She had no idea that a different kind of hell was already gathering strength over the Pacific, and that the devil was already in Montana, checked into the only motel in Darby, waiting for the weather forecast to confirm what he had been planning for months. December, 2nd week. The barometric pressure in the Bitterroot Valley dropped like a stone thrown off a cliff. Claire heard it on the AM radio first. The local meteorologist, a man named Hank who usually sounded bored delivering livestock reports and weekend fishing conditions. Hank did not sound bored. Hank sounded scared. Historic bomb cyclone. Category 5 winter storm. 4 feet of snow. Hurricane force winds. Temperatures dropping to 30 below zero. A storm system so massive it would cut the entire valley off from the outside world for a minimum of 72 hours. Sheriff Callahan came on next, his voice grave and clipped. If you are out on those county roads when this thing hits, you are on your own. We cannot reach you. Hunker down, stock your firewood, and pray for the grid. Claire spent the morning hauling firewood into the farmhouse. The sky above was a bruised, terrible shade of purple-black. The wind already howling through the cottonwood trees. The temperature dropping 20 degrees in 2 hours. She planned to ride the storm out in the farmhouse. The bunker was her panic room, her last resort. She had no desire to spend a blizzard locked in a windowless concrete box underground. At 11:47 a.m., her phone rang. The prepaid. The one only Ruth had the number to. Claire. Ruth's voice was tight, controlled, but underneath the control, something Claire had never heard in the old woman's voice before. Fear. There's a black truck parked at the Darby Pines Motel. Been there 2 days. Illinois plates. I wrote the number down. Rented by a man in a wool overcoat who paid cash and asked the front desk girl where the Hollow Creek property was. Claire's hand tightened on the phone. He asked about me by name. No, asked about the LLC. The girl didn't know. But he was in the diner this morning asking Billy Ferris about abandoned farms on the South Road. Silence. Claire, you hear me? I hear you. That storm is 3 hours out. Once it hits, nobody's moving. Not him, not me, not the sheriff. I know. You have your place ready, the place you built. Claire closed her eyes. It's ready. Then you know what to do. Ruth paused. And when she spoke again, her voice cracked. Just barely. Just enough. "You survived this. You hear me? You survived this. Because I did not drive 80 pounds of cement to your barn in July to read your obituary in March." The line went dead. Claire set the phone down on the kitchen counter. She looked out the window. The first flakes of snow were beginning to fall. Hard, dry, almost horizontal in the wind. She had 3 hours, maybe less, and somewhere on the road between the Darby Pines Motel and Hollow Creek Farm, a black Ford Raptor was already moving. At 2:15 p.m., the snow was no longer falling. It was attacking. Hard, dry flakes driven almost horizontally by a wind that had gone from howling to screaming in the span of 30 minutes. The cottonwood trees along the property line bent like old women bracing against a blow. The sky had turned from purple-black to something worse. A flat, dead, yellowish gray. The color of a bruise that has stopped healing. Claire stood at the kitchen sink, hands under the faucet, warm water running over her calloused palms. She was watching the half-mile dirt driveway that connected Hollow Creek Farm to the county road. She had been watching it for 2 hours, since Ruth's call. Part of her, the small, stubborn, irrational part that had kept her alive for 3 years, that part was hoping she was wrong, hoping Ruth was wrong, hoping the black truck at the motel belonged to a hunter, a realtor, a lost tourist who had taken a wrong turn off Highway 93 and would be gone by morning. That part of her died at 2:17 p.m., because at 2:17 p.m., a sleek black Ford Raptor turned off the county road and onto her driveway. The truck was obscene. That was the only word for it. Out here, where everyone drove mud-caked Chevys and rust-eaten Dodges with cracked windshields and hay in the truck beds. This vehicle looked like it had been teleported from a different planet. Pristine, aggressive. It stopped at the edge of the property line, engine idling, exhaust curling white into the freezing air. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out into the swirling snow. Dark, tailored wool overcoat. Not a Carhartt, not a parka. A coat designed for Michigan Avenue in December, not for what was coming. He walked to her mailbox, opened it, reached inside, pulled something out. An envelope. Claire watched him examine it, turn it over in his gloved hands, and smile, even from half a mile away, through the driving snow and the fogged kitchen window. She recognized that smile. She had seen it across dinner tables, in courtrooms, in the dark of their bedroom when he thought she was asleep and he was scrolling through her phone. Marcus Thornton. He had found her. But it was worse than that, because the envelope he was holding, the one he had pulled from her mailbox, was cream-colored, standard size, with handwriting she recognized even at this distance. Donna's handwriting. He had intercepted the letters, or at least this one, which meant he knew about the P.O. box, which meant he knew about Donna, which meant the one thread she had kept, the one connection to her old life, the one lifeline she had believed was safe. He had been holding it in his hand, probably for months, waiting, and he had timed this perfectly, arriving just as the worst blizzard in a century was about to seal the valley shut. No neighbors, no Sheriff Callahan, no witnesses, no one coming to help for a minimum of 3 days. He put the letter in his coat pocket, got back in the truck, and began driving slowly up her driveway. Claire's hands stopped shaking, which was strange, because her hands had been shaking for 3 years. Every time an unfamiliar car drove past, every time a branch snapped outside her window at night. But now, with Marcus less than 5 minutes from her front door, her hands went completely still, because this was the moment she had rehearsed 1,000 times, in the dark, in the bunker, on the military cot, running the scenario over and over until it was less a plan and more a reflex. If he comes, you do not hide. You make him believe you ran. Claire moved. 60 seconds. That was all she gave herself. She grabbed a small duffel bag from the bedroom closet, threw random clothing into it, a sweater, socks, a flannel shirt, left it unzipped, overturned on the living room floor. She knocked over a dining chair, let it clatter against the hardwood. She turned the kitchen stove burner to high, set the kettle on the flame. The water would take 3 minutes to boil, 4 minutes to scream. That screaming kettle would be the first thing Marcus heard when he walked through the front door, which meant he would know she had been here. Just now, minutes ago, she grabbed her heavy winter coat, her boots, her survival pack, the small backpack she kept by the back door for exactly this scenario, 2 bottles of water, a flashlight, a fire starter, a space blanket. She threw open the kitchen back door. The wind hit her like a wall of frozen glass, 30 degrees below zero with wind chill. Claire leaped off the back porch, landed in snow that was already 6 inches deep and accumulating fast. She ran toward the tree line at the eastern edge of the property. 50 yards, sprinting, making sure to leave deep. Chaotic, panicked footprints in the fresh powder. A woman fleeing in blind terror. That was the story she was writing in the snow. She hit the trees, stumbled behind a thick ponderosa pine, out of sight of the driveway, and stopped. Breathe, think, move. She doubled back, staying inside the tree line, hugging the blind side of the barn, the wind whipping her hair across her face, the snow falling so thick she could barely see 10 feet in front of her. She heard it, the heavy crunch of tires on frozen gravel, the low growl of a powerful engine pulling up to the farmhouse, a door slamming. Claire slipped through the side door of the barn. It groaned on its rusted hinges. She froze, listening. The wind was so loud that a groaning hinge was nothing. Inside the barn was dark, smelling of dust and old motor oil and dried alfalfa, the familiar smell of months of labor, of bleeding hands and aching muscles. She moved to the far corner. The old horse stalls, the 3 heavy hay bales stacked against the wall. She shoved the first bale aside, then the second, then the third, her arms burning. The bales were 60 pounds each, damp from the moisture in the air, heavier than usual. The false floor was exposed, the reclaimed barn wood, perfectly matched to the surrounding planks. Underneath, the heavy steel trapdoor, and the rusted iron ring that engaged the hydraulic lift. Claire grabbed the ring, pulled. The hydraulic piston hissed. The steel and wood hatch rose smoothly. A rectangle of darkness opened in the floor of the barn, the ladder descending into the dim glow of the LED lights 8 feet below. She climbed down, fast, her boots finding the wooden rungs from pure muscle memory. At the bottom, she reached up, grabbed the iron handle on the underside of the hatch, and pulled it shut. Thud. The sound of the steel door closing was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. Heavy, final, absolute. She slid the massive steel deadbolt into place, 3 inches of hardened steel engaging into a reinforced concrete frame. And she stood in the dim light, trembling, the silence ringing in her ears. She fumbled for the wall switch, clicked the LEDs brighter. Her bunker, her 12 by 10 concrete sanctuary, the military cot, the shelves of canned food, the bottles of water, the chemical toilet behind its partition, the air filtration system humming softly. Everything exactly as she had left it, for 3 seconds. Claire felt safe. Then, through the layers of earth, concrete, and steel, a sound. Creak, snap, footsteps, heavy, deliberate, methodical, walking across the wooden floorboards of the barn, directly above her head. Marcus was not in this farmhouse. Marcus was in the barn. He had not followed the footprints. Claire pressed both hands over her mouth, staring up at the ceiling. Why? Why hadn't he followed the footprints into the trees? Because Marcus Thornton thought 10 steps ahead. He always had. He had walked into the farmhouse, seen the overturned chair, the open back door banging in the wind, the kettle just starting to heat on the stove. And he had done the math. The water wasn't boiling yet. The kettle had been on the burner for less than 4 minutes, which meant Claire had been in the kitchen less than 4 minutes ago, which meant she had seen him coming from a distance, which meant she'd had time to think. And a woman who has time to think does not run into a blizzard at 30 below zero, because that is suicide. And whatever else Claire was, she was not suicidal. She was a nurse, a planner, a woman who had spent months building something in this barn. So Marcus went to the barn. The footsteps stopped, directly above the false floor. Claire clamped a hand over her mouth so hard, her teeth cut into the inside of her cheek. She could taste copper, tears streaming hot and silent down her face. Above her, a violent crash. A heavy, rusted metal bucket kicked across the barn floor. Then his voice, muffled by layers of steel and dirt and concrete, but unmistakable. That voice, the one that had told her what to wear, what to eat, who to talk to, who to stop talking to. The voice that had whispered, "I just want the best for you," while systematically erasing every piece of her identity until she couldn't remember who she was without him. Claire. Not yelling, conversational, almost gentle, the same tone he used in depositions when he was about to destroy a witness. "I saw the kettle, sweetheart. The water wasn't even boiling yet. You didn't run into the woods. You wouldn't last 10 minutes out there in this wind. And you know that, because you're smart, smarter than you think. I've always said that." You've always said that, as if it were a compliment. As if telling a woman she was smarter than she thought wasn't just another way of saying I decide how smart you are. "I know you're in here." His boots thudded closer, closer to the corner, closer to the hidden seam of her trap door. "You've been playing homesteader, haven't you?" "I checked the property records. An LLC out of Wyoming. Very clever, Claire. Very thorough. But you left a digital footprint when you paid the property taxes. Routing number traced back to a prepaid account opened in Billings. You always were careless with the small details." He stopped. He was standing on the false floor. Claire could feel him. Not physically, but the way you feel a storm before you see it. A pressure change, a weight in the air. Thump, thump, thump. His fists against the side of the tractor engine. He was leaning against it, using it as a rest, not suspecting for a moment that the massive engine block was hollowed out. A prop, light enough for Claire to push aside when she knew where to grip. "It's 20 below zero out there, Claire." His voice rose to compete with the escalating howl of the wind outside. The barn walls creaked. The roof groaned. The storm was arriving in full force. "The sheriff isn't coming. Nobody is coming. Come out now. We can go back to the house. Sit by the fire. Talk about this like adults." A pause. "If you make me tear this barn apart, piece by piece, I promise you, you are going to regret it." Claire did not move. She knew Marcus, better than she wanted to, better than anyone should have to know another person. She knew that his arrogance was real, but so was his impatience. He hated manual labor, hated getting his hands dirty, hated anything that required physical effort rather than mental manipulation. 10 minutes passed. The temperature in the barn above must have been dropping fast. Marcus was standing in a wooden structure with gaps in the walls wide enough to let the wind through, in a wool overcoat designed for a taxi ride, not a Montana blizzard. The pacing resumed, moving away from the corner. The side door of the barn shrieked on its rusted hinges, slammed shut. Heavy footsteps, receding into the howling white. He was going back to the farmhouse. Claire collapsed onto her military cot, her body shaking so violently the cot frame rattled against the concrete floor. She curled into a ball, arms wrapped around her knees. She had been 6 feet below him, and he had walked away. For now. By nightfall, the bomb cyclone hit its apex, The sound of the wind transformed from a scream into something beyond sound, a physical force, a vibration that Claire felt in her teeth, in her bones, in the concrete walls, like standing inside a drum being beaten by a giant. Even 8 feet underground, she could feel the massive cottonwood trees bending. She heard one go down at some point around midnight. A deep, wrenching, wooden groan followed by a concussive impact that shook dirt from the drywall seams above her. Claire sat at her small surveillance station, a folding desk in the corner, the battery-operated audio monitor, a cheap plastic receiver connected to a transmitter she had hidden in the barn rafters during construction. She flicked it on. Static, thick and crackling. Through the static, the devastation of the storm tearing at the barn's roof, timber groaning, iron roofing sheets flapping, nails shrieking as they were pulled from wood that had been standing since 1943, and beneath the roar, something else. Bang, 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 coming from the direction of the farmhouse. Marcus was inside her house, trapped by the same storm that had trapped her. Claire checked the digital thermometer mounted on the wall. Inside the bunker, 52 degrees. Cold, but survivable. Her body heat, the insulation, the thick layer of earth, all working together to keep the temperature stable. She wrapped herself in the sleeping bag, opened a can of baked beans with the manual can opener, ate them cold, in the dark. She had switched off the LED lights to conserve battery power. Cold baked beans in the dark. 3 years ago, she had been eating seared salmon at Gibson's Steakhouse in Chicago, sitting across from Marcus, wearing a dress he had chosen, drinking wine he had ordered, laughing at jokes he had approved. She would eat cold baked beans in the dark for the rest of her life before she would sit across that table again. She had food for a month, water for a month, a toilet, warmth. She just had to outlast him. When the storm cleared and the roads opened, Marcus would have to leave. She just had to wait. But at 3 a.m., something changed. The headache started slow, a dull throb at the base of her skull, like someone pressing a thumb against the bone. Claire shifted on the cot, adjusted the sleeping bag, drank some water. 30 minutes later, the throb became a pulse, deep, rhythmic, nauseating. She sat up. A wave of dizziness hit her so hard she had to grip the edge of the cot to keep from falling sideways. Her breathing. She noticed it now. Shallow, rapid, her chest rising and falling in short staccato bursts. No, she knew these symptoms. 8 years in the ER. Hypoxia patients. Carbon monoxide cases. The construction worker who fell asleep in an enclosed garage with the engine running. The elderly couple who closed all the windows during a winter storm and let the kerosene heater eat every molecule of oxygen in the room. She knew exactly what was happening. The ventilation system, her modified RV air filtration unit, the PVC intake pipe that ran up the side of the barn, ending in a curved, downward-facing cap designed to keep rain out, but not snow. Not 4 feet of horizontal hurricane-driven snow packing itself against the side of the barn, sealing the intake cap, creating an airtight plug over her only source of fresh air. The blizzard was burying her ventilation system, and the perfectly insulated, perfectly sealed, perfectly soundproof bunker was now functioning exactly as designed. As an airtight box, she was suffocating in her own sanctuary. By 6 a.m. on the second day, the bunker was a hypoxia chamber. The danger didn't announce itself with sirens or flashing lights. It crept, like fog, like Marcus. It came as a heaviness, a weight in the air that wasn't air anymore. Carbon dioxide levels climbing steadily in the sealed room. Nowhere to vent, nowhere to go. Claire's vision blurred at the edges, a gray vignette closing in. Her limbs felt wrong, heavy, disconnected, as if someone had replaced her blood with wet cement. She knew the timeline. She had studied it during the months of construction. She was running out of breathable air. If she didn't clear that intake pipe in the next few minutes, The confusion would transition seamlessly into unconsciousness. She would lie down on the cot, close her eyes, and die in her sleep, quietly, painlessly, in the dim LED light of the room she had built to save her life. Move. Claire rolled off the cot. Her knees buckled on contact with the concrete. She went down hard, chin hitting the floor, stars exploding across her vision. Get up! Get up, get up, get up! She couldn't get up. Her legs were not responding to instructions. The connection between her brain and her muscles had become a bad phone line. Static, dropped signals. So she crawled across the concrete floor, inch by inch, dragging herself with arms that felt like they belonged to someone else, toward the corner, where the PVC intake pipe protruded from the drywall, the cleanout cap, during construction. Claire's paranoia had driven her to install a threaded access cap at eye level on the intake pipe, a failsafe, in case a bird or debris ever blocked the vertical shaft. She had imagined a dead bird, maybe a clump of leaves, not 4 feet of hurricane-compacted snow, frozen into a block of ice. She pulled herself up using the shelving unit, her arms shaking so badly the cans on the shelf rattled, her vision swimming, the cap, heavy plastic, 6 inches in diameter, threaded onto the pipe. She gripped it, twisted. Nothing. The temperature differential had sealed the threads, cold on one side, warmer on the other. The plastic had contracted and locked. Come on. Her voice was a rasp, foreign to her own ears. She stripped off her heavy wool sweater, wrapped it around her hands, leaned her entire body weight into the twist. 118 pounds of oxygen-deprived woman, throwing everything she had into a 6-inch plastic cap. Her shoulders screamed. She felt something pop in her right hand. A tendon. A ligament. She didn't care. Hiss. The threads gave. The cap popped off. Claire stumbled backward. She grabbed the fiberglass rod, 5 feet long, flexible, originally purchased for sweeping the farmhouse chimney. She fed the rod into the open pipe, shoving it upward, blindly, into the dark vertical shaft. 8 feet up, 10 feet. The rod bowed against something solid, immovable. The snow, packed into the exterior vent cap, frozen into a dense block by the 30 below zero wind. Claire screamed. Not a word, not a name, just a raw sound torn from the bottom of her burning lungs. She rammed the fiberglass rod upward. Again, 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 each thrust weaker than the last. She was going to die. Right here. Right now. Not from Marcus. Not from a white rose on her pillow. From ice. From her own engineering. From the cruel irony of a woman who built an impenetrable fortress and forgot that fortresses need to breathe. One more. She drove the rod upward with everything she had. Shklump. A massive chunk of compacted snow dislodged, plummeted down the pipe, exploded onto the concrete floor in a spray of white powder, and air, a violent freezing jet of air blasted into the room. 30 below zero, the wind hitting her face like liquid nitrogen, burning her skin. But it was oxygen. Claire collapsed onto her back, directly under the pipe, mouth open, gasping, letting the freezing wind fill her lungs, feeling the dark spots in her vision begin to clear, feeling the crushing weight on her chest begin to lift. She lay there for 5 minutes, breathing, just breathing, the simplest act in the world, the one thing you never think about until it's taken away, and then it's the only thing that exists. She was alive, but her relief lasted exactly 11 seconds, because on the small wooden desk across the room, the audio monitor crackled to life. The heavy, warped barn doors above were groaning. Someone was forcing them open. Marcus had returned. Claire scrambled to her feet, lunged for the PVC pipe, screwed the cleanout cap back on with shaking hands, sealing the freezing air out, sealing herself back in. She pressed her ear against the monitor speaker. Through the cheap plastic, the concussive thud of the barn doors being shoved shut against the wind. And then, breathing, not steady, not measured. This was ragged, desperate, wet with mucus. The chattering of teeth so violent, it sounded like a small motor running. God damn it! Marcus's voice, but wrong, stripped of its polish, its control, shivering so badly the syllables fractured. He sounded like a man who was dying. And then Claire smelled it, faint at first, seeping down through microfissures in the wood and earth and concrete above. Smoke. Not clean wood smoke. Sharp, acrid, toxic. Claire understood. Marcus Thornton had never chopped a piece of firewood in his life, never built a fire that didn't involve a gas switch and a remote control. He lived in a luxury high-rise in Chicago with central heating and a concierge who handled anything more complicated than adjusting a thermostat, and he had tried to use her antique cast-iron wood stove. In a farmhouse he didn't know. With wood he didn't understand. With a chimney flue he probably never even noticed. Because men like Marcus didn't see infrastructure. They saw results. And when the results didn't materialize, when the stove smoked instead of heated, when the room filled with carbon monoxide because the flue was rusted shut, he had done what he always did when things didn't work. He forced it. He had probably shoved more wood in, maybe paper, maybe a piece of furniture. And the kitchen had caught, or the living room, or both, driven out by the smoke and the deadly cold. Marcus had fled to the only other structure on the property, the barn. Claire, his voice through the monitor, cracking, hysterical, an edge she had never heard in all the years she'd known this man. This was new. This was a man standing at the edge of something he couldn't litigate his way out of. I know you're under here. The house is burning. The power is dead. You have a bunker, don't you? Some paranoid little prepper hole. I know you, Claire. I know how you think. I've always known how you think. He began tearing the barn apart, through the monitor. Claire heard the shrieking of metal as he tipped over her heavy, rusted toolboxes, the shattering of dry-rotted wood as he took something heavy, probably the 10-pound sledgehammer she kept near the workbench, and began smashing the old horse stalls. Crack, smash, crash, systematic at first, then frantic. A man who had always controlled every variable in his life, suddenly confronting a variable he could not control. The cold. The cold was killing him, and he knew it. Every minute in this unheated barn, in a wet wool coat, in leather shoes designed for marble floors, every minute was another degree of core body temperature lost. Open the floor, his voice raw, tearing at itself. I know you're down there. I can feel it. Open the floor right now. And then, a new sound. Deep, heavy, metallic, scraping, iron against wood. He had found the tractor engine block. Claire backed away from the desk until her spine hit the cinder block wall. Through the monitor, the horrible grinding sound of Marcus throwing his entire body weight against the hollowed engine block. Adrenaline and hypothermia and desperation giving him strength he shouldn't have had. Scrape. The engine block shifted an inch. Scrape. Another inch. He was clearing the false floor. I see it. A scream. Triumphant. Manic. I see the seams. I found you. Open the door. Claire, open the damn door right now. He raised the sledgehammer. Boom. The first blow vibrated down through 8 feet of earth and concrete. Dust shaking from the drywall seams, the LED lights flickering. Boom. The reclaimed barn wood above shattered, splintering away, exposing the cold hard steel of the fireproof trap door. Boom, boom, boom. Each strike a deafening metallic ring that made Claire cover her ears and press herself against the wall, the sound reverberating through the small concrete space like being inside a bell. But the steel held. The industrial deadbolt didn't move a millimeter. The thick reinforced concrete frame absorbed the kinetic energy and distributed it harmlessly into the surrounding earth. Marcus Thornton had a sledgehammer, but he didn't have a blowtorch. He didn't have excavation equipment. He didn't have time. He didn't have warmth. He was just a cold, desperate, dying man, beating his fists against a door that would not open. "Claire." The sledgehammer stopped. His voice changed. The rage drained out of it, replaced by something she had never heard from him, pleading. "Claire, please, it's so cold. My hands. I can't feel my hands anymore. Please let me in. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything. Just open the door. Please, I'll leave. I'll sign the papers. I'll never contact you again. Just please, open the door." Claire stood in the center of her bunker, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the steel hatch above, and she remembered. She remembered the first restraining order, standing in front of a judge, hands shaking, explaining that her husband had broken into her apartment, that he had been standing over her while she slept, that she was afraid for her life. And Marcus, in his beautiful suit, with his beautiful voice, explaining to the judge that he was simply concerned for his estranged wife's mental health, that the rose was a peace offering, that he loved her and wanted to help. The judge had apologized. To Marcus, she remembered the second restraining order, and the third. She remembered being told by a court-appointed mediator that she needed to consider Marcus's feelings, that marriage was about compromise, that perhaps she was being too rigid. She remembered every time she had begged, for freedom, for safety, for someone, anyone, to believe her, and every time. Marcus had smiled, and nothing had changed. "Please, Claire, I'm going to die out here." She walked slowly to the desk. She looked at the audio monitor, the small, cheap plastic speaker crackling with static and the sound of a man weeping in a freezing barn. She didn't press the talk button. She didn't say a word, not of gloating, not of anger, not of revenge, not even of justice. There was nothing to say. There had never been anything to say. Because Marcus had never been a man you could reason with. He was a man you could only survive. And Claire knew, with the cold clarity of a nurse who had seen enough emergencies to know when a situation was beyond intervention, that opening that hatch would not save Marcus. It would kill her. He was hypothermic, desperate, unhinged, a man who had tracked her 2,000 miles and timed his arrival to a blizzard so there would be no witnesses. If she opened that door, she would not survive the night. This was not revenge. This was triage. Claire reached out with a steady hand and flicked the power switch to off. The static cut out instantly. The bunker descended into near total silence, only the faintest muffled sound penetrating from above, the clangs of the sledgehammer resuming, weaker now, slower, a dying rhythm. She pulled the sleeping bag around her shoulders, sat down on the edge of the cot, poured herself a measured glass of bottled water, and waited. Outside, the worst blizzard in a century reached its catastrophic peak. The wind tore across the Montana plains at 90 miles per hour. Visibility dropped to 0. The temperature bottomed out at 34 below. The farmhouse burned. Not spectacularly. The snow and wind fought the flames, smothering them, but the damage was done. The roof collapsed inward. The windows blew out. The structure that had stood since 1952 died whimpering in the storm. And in the barn, the massive rotting timber roof beams, built from old-growth Montana oak in 1943, maintained poorly for 40 years, not maintained at all for 20, weakened by water damage and termites and the slow, patient work of entropy. These beams had survived 100 winter storms, but they had never been asked to hold 4 feet of wet, heavy snow while being battered by sustained 90-mile-per-hour winds. They had never been asked to do the impossible. At 11:47 p.m. on the second night of the storm, they stopped trying. Groan. Snap. Claire felt it before she heard it. A vibration in the concrete floor. Deep. Seismic. like the earth itself was shifting. Then the sound, a colossal, earth-shaking crunch, tens of thousands of pounds of oak timber, iron roofing, rusted hardware, and 4 feet of compacted snow, all coming down at once. The bunker shook, the lead lights flickered, dust poured from every seam in the drywall, a crack appeared in the ceiling, thin as a hair, running from one wall to the other. The steel hatch above her rang like a gong as something massive struck it. Then silence. Total, complete, absolute silence. The sledgehammer had stopped. The begging had stopped. The wind was still screaming above. But from the barn, from the space directly above her head, nothing. No footsteps, no breathing, no voice calling her name. Claire stood perfectly still for a long time, staring at the hatch, staring at the thin crack in the ceiling, staring at the dust settling in the dim light. She sat down on the cot. She pulled the sleeping bag around her shoulders. She did not turn the audio monitor back on. She already knew what had happened. The old barn was gone, and Marcus Thornton was somewhere in the wreckage above, buried under beams that had stood for 80 years. And finally, mercifully, "Come down." Claire drank her water. She lay down on the cot. She closed her eyes, and for the second time in her life inside this bunker, she slept. Not peacefully, not deeply, but she slept because the monster above was finally silent. She did not yet understand that the silence was its own kind of trap, that the collapsed barn had sealed her hatch under thousands of pounds of debris, that the hydraulic system designed to lift a steel door could not lift the skeleton of an entire building. She did not yet understand that she had just traded one prison for another. That would come in the morning, when she climbed the ladder, pressed the green button, heard the motor scream against an immovable weight, and realized that the bunker she had built to save her life was now the place where she might die. But that was tomorrow's horror. Tonight, she slept, and above her, the storm raged on, burying everything. The farmhouse, the truck, the barn, the body, all of it disappearing under a white, cold, merciless silence. Morning came without light. That was the first thing Claire had to accept. That morning was no longer a thing she could see. It was a thing she had to decide. A number on the small digital clock sitting on the wooden shelf beside her cot. 7:14 a.m. The clock said so. The clock was the only authority left. She lay still for a long time, listening. The storm was still raging above. She could feel it in the subtle vibration of the walls, but from the barn itself, from the collapsed wreckage directly above her head, nothing. No footsteps, no breathing, no voice, just the heavy, absolute, permanent silence of a structure that no longer existed. Claire sat up, swung her legs off the cot, feet on the cold concrete. She pulled on her boots, laced them methodically. Left foot, right foot, double knots, the way she had laced them every morning for months of digging. The way she would lace them every morning for however long she remained down here. Because routine was survival. She knew that. 8 years of 12-hour ER shifts had taught her that the human mind could endure almost anything as long as it had structure, a schedule, a next thing to do. Take away the structure and the mind began to eat itself. She climbed the wooden ladder, rung by rung, until her head was inches from the steel hatch. She could see the deadbolt, massive, 3 inches of hardened steel, still engaged. She reached up, slid it open. The bolt moved smoothly. The mechanism was fine. She pressed the green button on the hydraulic control box mounted to the wall. The motor engaged, a high-pitched mechanical whine that filled the small space, the piston pushing against the steel door, the door lifting a fraction of an inch, maybe 2. Then it stopped. The motor screamed, a desperate, straining, overheating sound, metal against metal, the hydraulic system fighting something it could not move. The entire weight of the collapsed barn, Thousands of pounds of oak beams, iron roofing, hardware, snow, earth, all of it sitting directly on top of her exit. Claire hit the kill switch. The motor died. The door settled back. She pressed the button again. Same result. The motor shrieked. The door didn't move. She killed it. Again. Shriek. Nothing. Kill. Again. Claire, stop. She stood on the ladder, hands gripping the rungs, forehead pressed against the cold steel of the hatch. Think. You're a nurse. Think clinically. Assess the situation. Inventory your resources. Make a plan. She climbed back down. Inventory. She did it sitting on the floor, cross-legged, flashlight in her teeth, counting everything twice, because the first count was the panic count, the number your brain throws at you when it's terrified. The second count was the real one. Water, 43 bottles, 16 ounces each. At 1 bottle per day, 43 days. At half a bottle per day, 86 days. If she could collect condensation from the walls, maybe a little longer. Food, canned soup, 14 cans. Canned beans, 11 cans. Canned tuna, 8 cans. Protein bars, a box of 12. Dried fruit, 3 bags. Crackers, 2 sleeves. At 1/2 can per day, maybe 2 months, stretching it to the absolute breaking point, to the edge of what a human body could sustain before the organs started failing. Batteries. The Deep Cycle Marine Bank was at 62%. Running the LED lights full time would drain them in 3 weeks. Running them 1 hour per day. Maybe 3 months. Maybe 4. If she disconnected everything else, the small refrigerator, the audio monitor, the hydraulic control system. Except the hydraulic system, she couldn't disconnect that, because if anyone ever cleared the debris above, she would need every remaining volt to power one final attempt at opening the hatch. If. That word. If. Claire set the flashlight down, stared at the wall. Hollow Creek Farm was at the end of a dead-end county road. Her nearest neighbor was a mile away. She had no family in Montana, no employer expecting her at work. She had deliberately, meticulously, obsessively made herself invisible, which had been the whole point. And now the invisibility that had saved her from Marcus was going to kill her, because who would come looking? The county might send someone to check properties after the storm, but when a week, 2 weeks? And what would they find? A burned farmhouse, a collapsed barn, a snowdrift 8 feet high covering everything. They would assume the reclusive homesteader had fled before the storm, or died in the wreckage. They would not assume she was alive. 8 feet underground, rationing canned soup in the dark. Unless Ruth. Ruth knew about the bunker. Not the details, not the exact location of the hatch, but she knew Claire had been building something under the barn. She had delivered the cement, the rebar, the PVC fittings, and Ruth knew about the black truck. She had called to warn her. Would Ruth come looking? The storm would keep everyone locked down for days, maybe a week. Ruth was 72 years old, living alone on her own property 8 miles away. She would be dealing with her own storm damage, her own survival. But Ruth was also the woman who had survived a violent husband in 1982, who had rebuilt her life with her own hands, who drove 80 pounds of cement across the valley for a woman she barely knew, because she recognized something in her that words couldn't name. Would Ruth come looking? Yes, Claire believed that with everything she had left. Ruth would come looking. Ruth would call someone. Ruth would not stop until she had an answer. The question was when, and whether Claire would still be alive when that answer came. She picked up the flashlight, turned it off, and sat in perfect darkness. Okay, she thought. Okay, we wait. She established the protocol on day 1. Wake at 7 a.m. by the digital clock. 1 hour of light. Eat half a can of whatever she opened the day before. Drink half a bottle of water. use the chemical toilet, exercise for 20 minutes, push-ups, sit-ups, squats, whatever she could do in a 10 by 12 concrete box. At 8 a.m., she turned off the light. The LED clicked off and the darkness rushed in like water filling a sinking ship. Total, complete. So black that Claire could not see her own hand touching her own face. She had read about darkness like this: sensory deprivation studies, cave explorers, prisoners in solitary confinement. The research said the human brain could tolerate total darkness for about 72 hours before it started producing its own input. Hallucinations. Sounds that weren't there. Voices. The research was right. Day 4. She heard her mother. Not clearly. Not words she could transcribe. More like the melody of her mother's voice drifting through the concrete walls. The cadence. The rhythm. The way her mother used to hum while washing dishes. An old hymn. Off-key. Always off-key. Her mother couldn't carry a tune in a wheelbarrow, but the sound of it had been the soundtrack of Claire's childhood. She heard it now, in the dark, filtering through the earth. Claire pressed her palms against her ears, squeezed her eyes shut, which was pointless in total darkness, but the body does what the body does. It's not real. It's stress. It's your brain filling the silence, because the silence is too heavy to hold. The humming stopped. Claire lowered her hands, took a slow breath, then another. "I'm okay," she said out loud, to no one, to herself, to the concrete walls. "I'm okay." Her voice sounded wrong, thin, flat, absorbed by the earth before it could echo, like speaking into a pillow. She didn't speak again for 3 days. Day 9. She started the journal, not because she wanted to write, because she needed proof that she was still thinking clearly, that the thoughts in her head were connected to each other, that she was still Claire Whitfield, 34 years old, former ER nurse, survivor, not a ghost haunting her own grave. She wrote by flashlight, small letters, conserving pages. She had a single composition notebook, black and white marble cover. She had packed it in the bunker supplies as an afterthought, something to do if she ever got bored. Bored. That was funny, in a way that wasn't funny at all. Day 9. Storm still above. No sound from surface. Water 39 bottles. Food adequate. Temperature 44 degrees. Mental state functional. Scared but functional. She paused, pen hovering over the page, then wrote, "I keep thinking about Mrs. Delgado. Mrs. Delgado. Room 7. Rush University ER. 3 years ago. A Tuesday night. Claire remembered it the way you remember a photograph. Every detail frozen. 68 years old. Brought in by her adult daughter. Chief complaint chest pain. But that wasn't why she was really there. Claire saw the bruises on her wrists before the attending did, the way Mrs. Delgado flinched when anyone stood on her left side, the way her eyes tracked the door every time it opened. Claire had leaned in during the vitals check, close enough that no one else could hear. "Is someone hurting you?" Mrs. Delgado's eyes filled with tears. "My husband, 41 years. He never used to be like this." Claire held her hand and said something that she had learned in a domestic violence training seminar, but didn't fully understand until that moment. It doesn't matter when it started. It matters that it's happening now, and you deserve to be safe. Mrs. Delgado went home that night, back to her husband. Claire never saw her again, but she remembered. In the dark, 8 feet underground, she remembered holding that woman's hand, and she wondered if Mrs. Delgado ever found her way out, or if she was still there. In that house, with that man, 44 years now instead of 41. Claire closed the notebook, clicked off the flashlight, lay in the dark, and thought about all the women she had treated in the ER who had injuries they couldn't quite explain. falls that didn't add up. Burns in places burns don't usually happen. Broken ribs in women who said they tripped on the stairs. She had helped them. Clinically. Professionally. She had followed the protocol, asked the screening questions, provided the hotline number, documented the injuries. But she had never understood. Not really. Not the way you understand something when it's happening to your own body, in your own home. Done by hands that used to hold your face and tell you that you were beautiful. She understood now. Day 16. Marcus spoke to her. Not through the monitor, not through the earth, through her own head. She was lying on the cot, in the dark, half asleep, that thin, fragile membrane between consciousness and dreaming, and she heard his voice, clear as a phone call, as if he were sitting on the edge of her bed, the way he used to when they were married, when he would come home late from the office and sit beside her sleeping body and watch her. She hadn't known about the watching until later, until she found the photos on his phone. "You can't do this alone, Claire." She jerked awake, hands flailing, reaching for the flashlight, clicking it on, sweeping the beam across the bunker. Empty. Concrete walls, shelves, cot, toilet, air vent. No one. She held the flashlight with both hands to stop them from shaking. "You're not here," she said. "You're dead. You're under the barn. You're dead." Silence. "You are dead." The echo of her own voice was the only response, flat and small and swallowed by the earth. She didn't sleep for 41 hours after that. Day 23. She wrote about Ruth, not facts, not a timeline. She wrote about the feeling of Ruth, the weight of her, the gravity of a 72-year-old woman who had survived something terrible and come out the other side not bitter but quiet, not angry but watchful. A woman who had learned that the most powerful thing you could do for someone in pain was to simply be present without demanding an explanation. Ruth never asked what happened in Chicago. Ruth never asked about Marcus. Ruth never asked about the scars on Claire's hands, or the way she flinched at sudden noises, or the fact that she had installed 3 deadbolts on her farmhouse door. Ruth just showed up, every Saturday, with whatever Claire needed, and sometimes with things Claire didn't know she needed until Ruth put them in her hands. The bag of dried lavender. "Put this under your pillow. Helps with the nightmares. Don't ask me how I know." The battered paperback copy of West with the Night by Beryl Markham. "Read this when you're feeling small. This woman flew across the Atlantic alone. Makes our problems look manageable." The jar of homemade blackberry jam. No explanation. No note. Just jam. And that one sentence. Sitting on the porch, watching the sunset. "The hardest part isn't surviving. The hardest part is believing you deserved to survive." Claire wrote that sentence in her journal, then wrote it again, until it filled an entire page. Because down here, in the dark, with the silence pressing against her like a hand over her mouth, that sentence was the only thing standing between Claire and the voice that sounded like Marcus telling her she couldn't do this alone. She could. She was. Day 31. The food was running low faster than she had calculated. She recounted everything. Twice. 24 bottles of water, 7 cans of soup, 3 cans of beans, 1 can of tuna, no protein bars, no dried fruit, no crackers. She had been eating too much. Half a can per day was still too much. She needed to cut to a quarter can, which was roughly 300 calories per day, which was starvation by any clinical definition. Claire knew what starvation looked like. She had treated homeless patients in the ER who hadn't eaten in days. The sunken cheeks, the dry skin, the brittle hair, the way their bodies consumed their own muscle tissue for fuel, the cognitive decline, the irritability that gave way to apathy, the slow, quiet surrender of organs that could no longer sustain themselves. She was watching it happen to herself. Her clothes hung off her frame. The jeans she had worn into the bunker needed to be cinched with a piece of rope. Her arms were thin. The calluses on her hands seemed enormous against her shrinking wrists. She did her push-ups. 3. Down from 20. Her arms shaking violently on the third rep. She collapsed onto the concrete. Lay there, breathing. 3 push-ups. She used to do 30 during her gym sessions in Chicago, back when she had a body that was fed properly and slept in a bed with sheets and woke up to sunlight. 3. She laughed, that same thin, high sound, more breath than voice. 3 push-ups, she said to the ceiling. Marcus would be so disappointed. And then she stopped laughing, because she had just made a joke about Marcus, as if he were an annoying coworker, as if he were a character in a story, and not the man who had dismantled her entire existence and died 6 feet above her head. Something was shifting inside her, in the dark, in the hunger, in the silence. Something was loosening, not forgiveness, not anything as clean or simple as forgiveness. Distance. Marcus Thornton was becoming smaller, not the memory of him, not the damage he had done, but the power, the hold, the way his voice had lived inside her head for 3 years like a parasite, feeding on her fear, growing larger every time she thought about him, down here, where there was nothing to feed on. The parasite was starving too. Day 47. She wrote about Donna. Dear Donna, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know if I'll ever leave this room. But I need to write to you anyway, because writing to you is the closest thing I have to talking to another human being. I think about the letters, the ones you sent to the P.O. box, the ones that smelled like your hand lotion, that lavender stuff from Walgreens. Every letter ended the same way. I wasn't ready. I don't think I would have been ready for a long time. Maybe never. Because coming home and admitting that I had been a victim, and I hated that word more than I hated Marcus. Victim. It sounds passive, like something that happens to you while you stand still. But I wasn't standing still. I was running. I was building. I was digging a hole in the ground with my bare hands. That's not a victim. That's a survivor. But survivor is just a different word for someone who got hurt and didn't die yet. I don't know what word I want to be. Maybe just Claire. Maybe that's enough. She closed the notebook, set the pen down, and in the absolute darkness of her concrete room, she cried. Not the panicked crying of the first week, not the angry crying of the second. This was something older, deeper, the kind of crying that comes from a place so far down inside you that you didn't know it existed until the silence stripped everything else away. She cried for 30 minutes, maybe longer. Time moved differently in the dark, and when she stopped, she felt lighter, not happy, not hopeful, but lighter, as if something heavy had been sitting on her chest for 3 years, and she had just breathed it out. Day 53. She started talking to herself, not the mumbled reassurances of the first weeks, real conversations, out loud, in the dark, as if there were 2 Claires in the room, the one lying on the cot, and the one sitting in the corner, listening. She talked about the patients she missed, the ones she had saved and the ones she hadn't. The 4-year-old boy who came in choking on a grape and walked out an hour later holding his mother's hand and eating a popsicle. The 52-year-old woman who had a massive stroke in the waiting room and died before they could get her to a bed. She talked about her mother, the way her hands smelled like gardenia lotion, the way she made scrambled eggs, slowly, with too much butter, the way she called Claire every Sunday morning at exactly 8 a.m. and said the same thing every single time. Just checking you're still alive, sweetheart. She talked about Gerald, her stepfather, the quiet man who had married her mother when Claire was 7, who had never tried to replace her father because there was nothing to replace, who had simply shown up, every day, with patience and scrambled eggs and a willingness to sit through Disney movies he clearly hated because Claire loved them. Gerald had died of a heart attack when she was 19. dropped dead in the garage while changing the oil in his truck. Claire found him. She called 911. She started CPR. She did everything right, everything by the book. He died anyway, and that. She realized in the dark. That was the moment she became a nurse. Not when she enrolled in the program, not when she got her license. The moment she knelt on the cold garage floor and pressed her hands against Gerald's chest and understood that sometimes doing everything right is still not enough. But you do it anyway, because the trying matters, even when the outcome doesn't cooperate. She had been trying ever since. Day 60. She stopped hearing Marcus, not gradually, not day by day, just. One morning she woke up and the voice was gone, the familiar patronizing lilt that had been replaying in her head on a loop since Chicago, the sweetheart, and the I just want the best for you, and the you always were careless with the small details. Gone. Replaced by nothing. Silence. But a different kind of silence. Not the suffocating silence of the first weeks, not the terrifying silence that her brain filled with hallucinations and phantom voices. This silence was clean, open, like a room that had been emptied of old furniture, dusty, bare, but spacious. She wrote in the journal, Day 60. He's gone. Not from above. He's been gone from above since the barn fell. He's gone from inside. I can't hear him anymore. I think my mind finally let him go, or ran out of energy to keep him alive in there. Either way, the room in my head where I kept him, that room is empty now. I don't know what to put there instead. Maybe nothing. Maybe an empty room is okay. Day 73. The water was nearly gone. 6 bottles. The food was gone. She had eaten the last quarter can of tuna 2 days ago, scraping the tin with her finger, licking the oil from the metal. The hunger had passed through the sharp, cramping stage weeks ago and settled into something duller, a constant, low-grade nausea, a hollowness that wasn't pain exactly, more like absence. Her body was consuming itself. She could feel it, her muscles softening, her joints aching, her skin paper-thin and cold to the touch. She bruised if she bumped the shelving unit. Purple-yellow marks that spread like watercolors across her arms. She stopped exercising on day 65. There was nothing left to exercise with. Her body was running on reserves that were running on reserves. She spent most of her time lying on the cot, conserving energy, conserving heat. The temperature in the bunker had dropped to the low 40s. She wore every piece of clothing she possessed, 2 pairs of socks, thermal underwear, jeans, a sweater, a fleece jacket, the sleeping bag wrapped around everything, still cold, always cold. She slept 14 hours a day, sometimes more, her body demanding unconsciousness the way it once demanded food, and in the sleeping hours, she dreamed, not nightmares, not anymore. The nightmares had burned themselves out weeks ago. Now she dreamed about ordinary things, making coffee in the farmhouse kitchen, the sound of the percolator, the smell of dark roast, sitting on the porch with Ruth, watching deer graze in the field at dusk, writing a letter to Donna, sealing the envelope, walking to the post office in town, the bell above the door jingling. Small things, quiet things, the things you never think about when you have them and can't stop thinking about when they're gone. Day 81. She wrote the last entry she had energy for. If anyone finds this journal, my name is Claire Whitfield. I'm 34 years old. I was a nurse. I came to Montana to hide from a man who wanted to own me. I built this room to survive. I did survive. For a while. If Ruth Begley is alive, tell her she was right. The hardest part wasn't surviving. The hardest part was believing I deserved to. But I believe it now. I believe it. If Donna Kessler gets this, tell her I was coming home. I was ready. I just ran out of time. I am not a victim. I am not a survivor. I am Claire. That is enough. She closed the notebook, set it on the shelf, beside the empty water bottles, beside the empty cans, and she lay down on the cot and closed her eyes and waited for sleep, for rescue, for whichever came first. Day 89. The vibration woke her. She wasn't sure she was awake at first, because the boundary between sleeping and waking had dissolved somewhere around day 75. She existed in a permanent twilight now, a gray space between consciousness and dreams. She could be awake and dreaming at the same time, or dreaming about being awake. The distinction had stopped mattering, but the vibration was different. It traveled through the walls, through the concrete floor, through the metal frame of the cot, a rhythmic thumping, deep, mechanical, not wind, not settling debris, not the earth shifting, an engine. Claire opened her eyes. The bunker was dark. She had disconnected the LED lights 2 weeks ago to preserve the last reserves of battery power for the hydraulic system. She had one chance to open the hatch, if there was ever anything to open it for. She lay still, listening. The thumping grew louder, closer, the unmistakable diesel rumble of heavy equipment, a backhoe or an excavator, something big enough to shake the ground from a distance. Something was digging above her. Claire sat up, her joints cracking, her vision sparking with dark spots. She swung her legs off the cot and they hit the concrete floor, and she sat there for a long moment because the simple act of sitting upright required all of her concentration. She reached for the flashlight, clicked it on. The beam was weak, yellow, dying, but enough. She stood up. The room tilted violently. She grabbed the shelving unit, steadied herself. Her heart was beating too fast, not from excitement, from the strain. Her malnourished body protesting any demand beyond lying still. She walked to the ladder. 3 steps. It took her almost a minute. Shuffling, one hand on the wall. She looked up at the hatch, the steel plate, the deadbolt, the hydraulic control box with its single green button. The thumping above was getting louder. She could hear it clearly now, the grinding churn of a diesel engine under load, the scraping of metal on frozen earth, the crack of wood being pulled apart. Someone was dismantling the wreckage above her. But who? And why were they looking for her? Or were they just clearing debris from a property they assumed was empty? It didn't matter, because if she didn't try now, while there was someone up there, while the machinery was close enough to feel, she might not get another chance. Claire climbed the ladder. Every rung was a negotiation between her arms and gravity, her muscles trembling so violently that the ladder shook against the wall. Her hands, the same hands that had dug this room out of Montana clay, that had dragged bags of dirt through the night, that had poured concrete and hammered rebar and turned a hole in the ground into a fortress. Those hands could barely grip a wooden rung, but they held. She reached the top, her face inches from the steel hatch. She could hear the machinery clearly now, very close, right above her, the vibration so strong that dust was dancing on the surface of the steel plate. She slid the deadbolt open. She looked at the green button. The batteries were nearly dead. She knew that. The hydraulic system needed a sustained burst of power to drive the piston, if the batteries couldn't deliver it. The motor would engage for a second, maybe 2, then die, and that would be it. One chance. Claire pressed her palm flat against the steel hatch. The metal was cold, freezing. She could feel the weight above it, tons of debris pressing down. She thought about Ruth, sitting on the porch, drinking coffee from a thermos, watching the sunset over the Bitterroot Range. She thought about Donna, at her kitchen table in Oak Park, writing a letter in her careful handwriting, sealing it, walking to the post office, sending it to a P.O. box in Montana, not knowing if anyone would ever read it, sending it anyway. She thought about Mrs. Delgado, room 7, the bruises on her wrists, the question Claire had asked, "Is someone hurting you?" She thought about Gerald, on the garage floor, and the 19-year-old girl who knelt beside him and pressed her hands against his chest and tried to bring him back because trying mattered, even when it didn't work. She thought about the journal, sitting on the shelf below. With every thought she had managed to pull from the silence and pin to paper. I am Claire. That is enough. She closed her eyes, took a shallow breath of stale air, the last breath she would take in this room, and slammed her fist onto the green button. The motor engaged, a shrieking, grinding, desperate mechanical scream that filled the bunker and reverberated off the concrete walls. The LED lights, disconnected but still wired to the battery bank, flickered once, a ghostly strobe, then went dark. The piston pushed. The steel hatch pressed upward against the weight of the world. For one sickening, airless, eternal second, nothing happened. The motor screamed louder, the batteries dumping every remaining volt into the hydraulic system, the voltage dropping, the motor slowing, the pitch of the scream descending like a siren winding down. No, 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 no. Not now. Not after everything. Not after 89 days in the dark. Not after surviving Marcus and the blizzard, and the suffocation, and the starvation, and the silence and the voice in her head, and the 3 push-ups, and the cold baked beans, and the journal, and the crying, and the empty room where Marcus used to live. Not now. Claire pressed the button harder, as if her finger pressure could add voltage to a dying battery, as if wanting it badly enough could generate electricity from sheer willpower. And then, a sound like a gunshot. The hatch cracked upward, an inch, 2 inches, the debris above shifting, wood splintering, frozen earth crumbling, something massive sliding sideways. The motor died. The batteries were gone. Every electron spent, but the hatch was open, 3 inches. And through those 3 inches, a blade of light, sunlight, white, blinding, searing, the most violent and beautiful thing Claire had ever seen. She pressed her shoulder against the steel plate, pushed with everything she had left, which was almost nothing, which was barely enough to stand, but the initial crack had broken the seal, the debris had shifted, and the hydraulic piston, even without power, held the door at its current height, a mechanical lock that would not let gravity win. Claire pushed, her shoulder against the steel, her legs bracing against the ladder rungs, her teeth clenched, her vision whiting out, a sound coming from her throat that she would never be able to describe. Not a scream, not a groan, something more primitive than language, the sound of a human body refusing to die. The hatch rose. 6 inches, 12, the debris above cascading sideways, plywood and shattered oak and frozen mud tumbling away, light pouring in, cold air, fresh air, the smell of pine and wet earth and melting snow, and voices, above ground. Sheriff Callahan had been standing at the edge of the excavation site, drinking coffee from a thermos, watching the backhoe operator pull apart the collapsed barn. They had found the Ford Raptor 2 days ago, buried near the tree line. A utility crew had spotted the bumper sticking out of a melting snowdrift and called it in. The plates came back to Marcus Thornton. Chicago. Missing since December. His firm had filed a report when he didn't return from what he told his secretary was a personal trip to Montana. Then they found the farmhouse, or what was left of it, a charred, snow-crushed ruin, the cast-iron stove still standing in the middle of the wreckage. Then the barn. And in the barn, under the central beam, Marcus, perfectly preserved by 3 months of freezing temperatures, a sledgehammer lying near his right hand. The investigators had a theory. The ex-husband tracked her down, started a fire in the house, chased her into the barn. The storm brought the roof down on both of them. They were preparing to bring in cadaver dogs to find Claire's remains in the frozen mud. And then the earth moved. Callahan jumped back, his coffee going sideways. The backhoe operator killed the engine. The 2 deputies standing nearby drew their weapons. A sheet of plywood burst upward from the ground. then a massive steel plate, grinding against concrete, shoved upward by something underneath. The deputies shouted, weapons aimed at the hole in the earth, and from the dark rectangular void, a hand, thin, shaking, dirt-caked fingernails, gripping the edge of the frozen concrete. A second hand, and then Claire Whitfield pulled herself out of the earth. She was barely recognizable as a person, skeletal, skin translucent, eyes squinting against light she hadn't seen in 89 days, blinking, tearing up, not from emotion, from the sheer physical pain of sunlight hitting retinas that had adapted to total darkness. She knelt in the mud, chest heaving, arms shaking, gasping at the air, cold, clean, impossibly sweet, the taste of spring, of melting snow, of pine sap warming in the afternoon sun. The deputies rushed forward, shouting for medics. Callahan dropped to his knees beside her, his gruff voice gone soft. "Claire Whitfield, are you? Claire Whitfield?" Claire looked up, past Callahan, past the deputies, past the ambulance pulling up the muddy driveway. Her eyes found the black body bag lying near the wreckage. She stared at it, for a long time, not with triumph, not with hatred, not even with relief, with finality. Then she looked away from the body bag, and up, into the endless bright blue sky, the first sky she had seen in 3 months, cloudless, depthless. "I'm Claire," she whispered, "and I'd like to go home now." She collapsed into the mud, and the medics were there, and the stretcher was there, and the blanket was there. Warm, wool, smelling like the back of an ambulance. The most wonderful smell in the world. St. Patrick Hospital, Missoula. Room 414. 3 days of eye fluids, refeeding protocol, monitored reintroduction of solid food because a starved body could die from eating too quickly. The irony of that. Survive 89 days without food, die from a turkey sandwich. Claire lay in the hospital bed. Clean sheets, warm blankets, a window that looked out onto a parking lot. The most beautiful parking lot she had ever seen. She was awake when Ruth walked in. The old woman appeared in the doorway. Braid, flannel, a ceramic bowl covered with aluminum foil cradled in her rough hands. She didn't say hello. She walked to the bedside, set the bowl down on the tray table, peeled back the foil. Chicken soup, homemade. The smell of it filled the room, and Claire's eyes filled with tears, and she couldn't tell if she was crying because she was alive, or because she was hungry, or because Ruth Begley had driven an hour and a half to bring her soup. All three. Probably all three. Ruth sat down in the vinyl chair beside the bed, looked at Claire. "You look terrible." Claire laughed, a real laugh, the first one in 3 months, thin and cracked and painful, but real. "You drove 90 miles to tell me I look terrible. I drove 90 miles to bring you soup. The looking terrible part is a bonus observation." Silence, the good kind. Then Ruth said, "I called Callahan the day after the storm broke, told him you didn't run, told him you were the kind of woman who would have stayed, who would have planned for something like this. I told him to dig. He almost didn't listen." "He did listen. He just didn't believe me until they found the truck." Claire reached for Ruth's hand. Ruth let her take it. The old woman's fingers were rough and warm and steady. "You believed I was alive." "I didn't believe anything. I knew." Ruth squeezed her hand once, hard. "Because I know what women like us do. We don't run into storms and die. We dig holes and survive. That's what we do." Claire held Ruth's hand, and for a while neither of them said anything else. The soup steamed on the tray table. The parking lot sun slanted through the window, and 2 women who had survived different storms in different decades sat together in the quiet and let the silence be something other than a weapon. Sheriff Callahan came the next afternoon. He stood at the foot of the bed, hat in his hands. "Ms. Whitfield, I need to take a statement. When you're ready." I'm ready. He pulled out a notebook, and Claire told him everything. Chicago, Marcus, the restraining orders, the White Rose, the LLC, Montana, the bunker, the storm, the confrontation through the steel door, the collapse. Callahan listened without interrupting, writing slowly. When she finished, he closed the notebook. There's something you should know. We found letters in Thornton's vehicle, in the glove compartment. Correspondence between yourself and a Donna Kessler in Illinois. Claire's chest tightened. He intercepted them. Appears so. At least 3 of them. The most recent was dated November. Ms. Kessler has been contacted. She's aware you're alive. A pause. She's on a flight. Gets into Missoula tomorrow morning. Claire pressed her hand against her mouth, not to stifle a cry, to hold something in, something too large and fragile to release in front of a sheriff holding a notebook. Also, Callahan shifted his weight. Miss Begley made a phone call to my office at 6 a.m. on the first clear morning after the storm, before the roads were fully plowed, before the utility crews had even started their rounds. What did she say? She said, and I'm quoting directly because my dispatcher wrote it down word for word. She said, "There's a woman at Hollow Creek Farm and she is alive underground, and if you don't get a backhoe out there today, I will drive mine through your office window." Claire stared at him. Ruth has a backhoe. Ruth has a lot of things. Callahan put his hat back on. Get some rest, Ms. Whitfield. You've earned it. He walked out. Donna arrived the next morning, 9:47 a.m. Claire knew the exact time because she had been watching the clock since dawn. The door opened, and there she was, 67 years old, 5'2", silver hair shorter than Claire remembered, wire-rimmed glasses, wearing a coat that was too thin for Montana in March, and carrying a tote bag from the Oak Park Public Library. She stood in the doorway, looking at Claire. Claire looked back. 3 years of letters, of code words and P.O. boxes and handwritten sentences that traveled 1,000 miles through the United States Postal Service because a phone call might get someone killed. Donna set the tote bag down, walked to the bed, sat on the edge of the mattress, put her arms around Claire, and Claire, who had held herself together through a collapsing barn and a frozen bunker and 89 days of darkness and silence and hunger and the voice of a dead man in her head. Claire fell apart. She sobbed into Donna's shoulder, the way a child sobs, without dignity, without restraint. And Donna held her, rocking slightly, her hand on the back of Claire's head, her voice in Claire's ear. "I'm here. You're safe. You did it. You made it home." 6 weeks later, May. Claire drove out to Hollow Creek Farm one last time, windows down, spring air warm and smelling of wildflowers. The farmhouse was gone, just a charred foundation and a standing chimney. The barn was gone, a cleared lot. The bunker filled in with fresh earth by the county work crew. Claire stood at the edge of the filled earth, her boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. Ruth's truck pulled up behind her, the green Ford, a bag of something heavy in the truck bed. Always a bag of something heavy. Ruth got out, walked over, stood beside her. "You going to rebuild and no? Good. Place was ugly anyway." Claire laughed. "I'm going back to Chicago, going back to nursing." Ruth nodded. "Good. You were wasted on fence posts." Claire reached into her jacket pocket, pulled out the composition notebook, black and white marble cover, 89 days of entries. She handed it to Ruth. "Read it, when you feel like it." Ruth took the notebook, turned it over in her rough hands. "What's in it?" "Everything I couldn't say out loud." Ruth tucked the notebook under her arm. "I'll read it on my porch, with coffee." They hugged, briefly. Ruth was not a hugger. The embrace lasted exactly 3 seconds, which was enough. Claire got in her car. Ruth got in her truck, and Claire Whitfield drove away from Hollow Creek Farm, down the dirt road, past the feed store, past the gas station, past the sawmill, through the tiny town of Darby and onto Highway 93, heading north toward Missoula, where Donna was waiting at the airport with 2 tickets back to Chicago. She drove with the windows down, the spring air filling the car, the mountains behind her, the road ahead, in her pocket. Donna's last letter, the one she had memorized in the dark, the one she had whispered to herself on the nights when the silence was too heavy to bear alone. "We're still here. Come home when you're ready." She was ready.